Thank you so much. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this workshop as well. And I will be broadly talking about the economics behind sustainable tech development. And I will keep it in relatively broad terms to talk about, okay, these are potential issues to think about rather than going into the nitty-gritty, which we had previously. So previously we had, the power consumption of specific tasks. You want to have a specific app in a specific place. How do you decide that? And here we look just a bit more of other factors or things that you want to consider. And the factors we're looking at, or the things we're looking at, is first we look at externalities more broadly. So what are they? How do they work? Then we will look at a bit about how do we actually measure the emissions? And this would be very important for government policies because more and more governments around the globe are doing some form of carbon pricing. Be it cap and trade, as mentioned in the previous talk already, or taxes or subsidies, etc. And there's an additional factor which is coming online over the next year. It already has started in the implementation phase, and that is border adjustments. And so that is potentially becoming a really big item in the next couple of years that will influence a lot, potentially, where you want to locate yourself. And then lastly, just to add on top a little bit, if we talk more about data centers more broadly, to bring it back into the topic of the workshop, where should you locate them? Are there any additional factors to consider except for, everything costs money, and so based on the cost of money, you will obviously decide on some location, but there might be additional factors to consider based on renewable energy and sustainability, which go a little bit beyond or are slightly different from what you've heard so far, to just as additional measures. Let's start with externalities. So sustainability, especially in economics, is traditionally closely related to these externalities. What is an externality? Externalities are a cost or benefit, and the important thing is it can be costs or benefits. So it can also be something positive of some economic activities that affect people outside of the explicit transaction. What does that mean? Well, if I buy something in a grocery store, this might affect my neighbor directly or indirectly, either in a positive way or negative way, and that would be an externality. The very classical economics example that has basically spurred the literature since the 80s or so is that you have a chemical plant, and the chemical plant can discharge waste into a lake, and in this lake are fish and fishermen who live off catching fish. Well, when the chemical plant decides how much of the chemical waste to discharge into the lake, they don't care about the fishermen. They don't care about the revenue of these fishermen when doing this, their cost calculation. And so you end up with a situation which is basically in this picture. You have the chemical plant in the middle, and the chemical plant is just putting waste into this, well, in this case, a river, or a lake, and then all the fish die, and so all the fishermen, which you can see on the left-hand side here, will be out of a job, and their livelihood is jeopardized. Well, what is a typical solution of this problem? Because just looking at it, the chemical plant is very difficult to be convinced to stop putting wastewater into the lake and killing the fish. Well, the strict economic issue that we have identified is there are no clear property rights on the lake that can be enforced, but which means we can use that as a solution of the mechanism. If we assign property rights to either the fishermen or the chemical plant, and they can enforce their property rights, we can resolve this issue, and suddenly the pollution becomes part of the whole discussion and the calculation. And I'll talk in a second how about that works. An alternative is to talk about taxation. So I can, as a government, step in and say, well, if you want to dispose of any wastes, it's going to cost you some money. I don't need to assign specific property rights to the lake or, in this case, but there could be taxation. There could also be general regulation saying you're not allowed to dump specific chemicals into a lake, which is particularly problematic. Now, depending who is the person who makes decisions, one or the other or the third option will be chosen. So if you have a lot of people involved in the fishing industry and only 1, 2 in the chemical plant, it's probably that taxation and regulation is easier to pass than doing something on property rights or other factors. So how does it solve the problem if we assign property rights? For simplicity, let's assume the fishermen own the lake. For the purpose of this argument, it doesn't matter whether the chemical plant owns it or the fishermen own it. But let's assume the fishermen own the lake and have enforcement abilities so they can stop anybody from using the lake if they are in disagreement. So what will the fishermen then do? They go to the chemical plant, hey, you can't dump your waste here. And the chemical plant will say, well, what can I do otherwise? Okay, can I pay you something for dumping this waste? And so the fishermen at the chemical plant will come to an agreement at some point and say, okay, the chemical plant will pay the fishermen a certain amount to discharge some of their chemical waste into the lake, which will reduce the revenue of the fishermen, but they're compensated in terms of being paid for this waste dumping. And that is the basic idea how you can resolve the externality. Now you can turn it around and say, okay, it's the chemical plant actually owning the lake. Well, if it's the chemical plant owning the lake, then the fishermen can pay the chemical plant to allow them to still fish, meaning that they dump less waste into the lake. So it kind of resolves the issue both ways. Now, when the chemical plant decides how much waste to dump into the lake, there is either some revenue or some additional cost involved, meaning they will internalize this externality, take it into account when they do their cost calculation. And so this is the really important part when we talk about environmental stuff as well and sustainability. 50 years ago, 80 years ago, and so on, air quality, nobody cared about. Pollution, nobody cared about. Well, some parts of pollution people already cared about, but much more limited than today. And so as a result, if I am a manufacturing company and I can pollute the air, and that's the cheapest way to just produce, I will continue to produce like that and just pollute the air or lakes or other areas. Or put differently, if I'm an electricity producer, I just keep firing up the coal plant without any filters or anything to produce as much electricity as cheaply as I can, because that will maximize my revenue. And so over time, people have included more and more and more factors or more and more regulation and assigned property rights to some extent to ensure that, oh, by the way, pollution is not that great. How can we get this coal power plant to install filters to reduce or incentivize them to reduce their emissions? And the way to do that is typically regulations and to have a carbon trading type system in place. Okay, well, but before we can have this carbon trading system or carbon pricing method, we need to figure out how do we actually measure these emissions. The key thing here is that a lot of most countries, at least most Western countries, or most developed and developing countries, have instituted some form of carbon pricing. Meaning, if I send a ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent, because there are lots of different gases, then I need to pay a certain amount as a tax or fee or whatever you want to call it, because I'm polluting the air and creating this greenhouse effect. So, for example, the current rough price of a ton of CO2 in Europe is roughly 70 euros. And so if I emit a ton, then I need to pay 70 euros. Well, but how do I know, or how does the government know I actually emitted this 1 ton? So there's basically 2 ways to measure it. And the EU trading system they've used up until today, and they're reforming it right now, basically put a sensor in front of the exhaust pipe and figured, okay, how much are you emitting? And that's the CO2 you are emitting. Much more straightforward approach that is used in projecting what is the carbon footprint of something, particularly in economic analysis, for example, the World Bank and or IFC, who are doing development projects and decide should something be pursued and what is the environmental impact on that, they use a slightly different approach. What is that approach? Well, how is CO2 produced? CO2 is produced by burning fuel. Well, that's not the only way to do it, but that's one of the big components of producing CO2. Well, how can I measure how much fuel has been burned? Well, we can measure how many gallons of oil or barrels of oil have been consumed by a specific country. We can calculate how many tons of or cubic meters of gas have been burnt, etc. So all we need to do is we need to look at fuel. And then we have a quick or easy formula how to convert a ton of coal into CO2 if it's burned. Now, there are some assumptions with filtering methods and stuff because not just CO2 is produced, but a lot of other greenhouse gases and some of them way worse. But installing the right type of equipment, you can reduce that as well. And so that is a very straightforward way of measuring it. Take fuel, how much fuel was consumed or how much fuel was burnt, and in the process of running a car, in process of an electricity power plant, etc. And that's how we can easily measure how much CO2 was produced. So some conversion factor, 1 liter of gasoline is equal to X tons of CO2. Okay, and since this is much easier to measure and also makes a lot of sense for a lot of applications, the new EU trading system will be using this approach for some sectors and some industries. Now, there are clear exceptions to this. If I'm a farmer and have cattle produces a lot of methane. We can't just say, okay, they eat that much grass because we can't measure the grass easily that is eaten by a cow unless they are in a farmhouse or if they're outside on the meadow and just eating grass. We can't measure how much grass they're eating and the conversion rate of methane and stuff. We can't do that. So what is typically used is in a year, a cow produces X tons of CO2 equivalent. Methane is 100 or 1,000 times worse than CO2, so you have just an adjustment factor there. And so you track these emissions through basically number of cattle that farmers have. This is an approximation because we cannot measure the exact amount of CO2 put into the air. We need to take some approximation approaches. Also, you know, if I'm living in an area where you can just dig and get some coal or produce some coal yourself, then there's very difficult to track that as emissions. And so emission tracking is never perfect, but we're doing a reasonable job, I would say, particularly in Europe, on doing so, and in China as well, I would argue. In some other places around the globe, there's very limited control on these emissions, so it's much harder to do so. But even though we have close tracking in some places and others, we can still, if we want to, let's think we want to build a data center, we know that the typical data center with that energy consumption will produce that much CO2, both when it's built and when it's running. And so based on this, we can then estimate in places where we don't have any explicit measurement of this CO2 production, how much a potential data center would produce and in emissions. Okay, so how is this then implemented, or how is the carbon pricing working? Well, here you can see the EU carbon pricing, the price of 1 ton of CO2 in the euro area, or sorry, in the EU over time since 2010. And you can see that the price was very close to zero in the early 2000s or in the 2010s. And then it has picked up rapidly and now is, well, was almost 100, but now is around 70-ish. Note that it's like a year old, this data, so it's not the most recent, but you know, today it's like 69 or 80 or 71 or something. So it's around 70. And you can see there are some spikes, some increases, decreases, and particularly in the early years of the EU trading system. And I'll talk more about how this stuff works in detail in a moment. They misjudged how the system works, and so the prices were basically zero. But now everything has kind of stabilized over a couple of years, and we got some prices that are more sensible. Okay, so why do we do carbon pricing, and how does this work? So we have the Paris Agreement, which means we need to reduce carbon emissions, or CO2 emissions and the equivalent thing. Well, the big question is, who needs to reduce how much? There are certain industries which currently pollute a lot, or before the agreements and before doing this carbon pricing, polluted a lot, but it's very, very easy to reduce that massively. Think of a coal power plant. A coal power plant produces obviously CO2, but if I burn coal, it produces a lot of other gases and emissions, and those are much more potent than CO2. So all I need to do is basically improve the process of burning coal, put a filter in, and make sure that the coal is properly burnt and more uniform in the sense of what are the parts that are in that coal. And then I can reduce my emissions quite substantially, because then all I emit is CO2 and not all these other things which are way worse than CO2. So that means that it's relatively cheap for a coal power plant to reduce its emissions quite substantially. If you take a different industry, I don't know, you take a steel power plant, or aluminum plant that produces steel and aluminum. Or you can also take concrete factory, a concrete mill. Those are things which are very difficult to reduce their emissions. They're very energy intense industries and thus have a lot of pollution, but they mainly, their reduction might be much harder. And so it doesn't make sense to say across the board, every industry needs to reduce their emissions by 10%. And economists and politicians have very quickly realized that, which means we need to incentivize places where it's easy to reduce emissions, to reduce them quickly, and places where it's much harder to reduce emissions to avoid increasing them dramatically. And so in order to do so, there are basically two ways. One is I say, okay, if you emit X, that's how much you need to pay per unit you emit. And then everybody faces exactly the same price and can then emit whatever based on that price is worthwhile to emit. The alternative is to produce this cap and trading system where I say, okay, we have a capacity of 1 million tons of CO2 for this year, and I allow you to trade these 1 million tons whichever way you want. I don't care what the price will be, but you can only emit 1 million tons. Now, countries have decided that and have figured that putting a cap on how much emissions there can be at most is much easier than saying, okay, if we put a tax of 10 euros per ton of CO2, I have no idea how much emissions will afterwards be. And changing a tax rate can be very, very lengthy process. So it's much easier and quicker to say, okay, we have 1 million tons of emissions. That's all we have. Next year we have 900,000 tons. And so we keep reducing that. Is much easier as a process and as a pricing mechanism. And we let the price do whatever it does. And firms will then reduce their emissions accordingly. And that's the main trading system most countries have used that have emissions trading systems, so ETS or so. Now, it is important to cover as many industries or as many carbon emissions as possible in the system, and the EU has increased its share covered under ETS or the emissions trading system to around 45% right now. But they are eager to expand it even further to the emissions trading system 2, and that will cover, together with the first one, roughly 80% of emissions. So what is not included currently? So under the 45%, we're not including agriculture, road transport, and heating and cooling of buildings, as well as waste management. So if you have a power plant that basically burns our garbage, they're not counted towards emissions. If you have a farm with a lot of cattle that produce methane, that's not counted. in the initial ETS system. If you refuel your car, that is not directly included into these ETS system. And similarly, if you heat your house with oil or gas or some other kind of carbon intensive emissions, that's not counted either. This will change for next year, a couple of years. Once ETS 2 is live, everything except for agriculture and waste management will be included in that new system. And if you want to see what does that mean, well, if you look in this graph here, you can see that residential and commercial, agriculture, they're both roughly 10%. You have waste, that's roughly 3%. And you have domestic transport, which is 23%. So together, plus minus a little bit here and there, that will make up the roughly 55% that have not been covered. But given that domestic transport will be included and the residential and commercial kind of heating will be included, that adds another 35 or so percent to it. So we are somewhere between 80 and 90% coverage once this ETS2 system is up and running. Okay, well, this is great. We have this carbon pricing system in Europe. So that means if I produce aluminum in Europe, I need to pay a specific tax because of my emissions. However, if I go to some African country as an example, I'm not kind of saying that there are specific countries which do that, but let's take a random country. Yeah, I ignored the continent. Let's assume there's a random country, and in that country, we don't have any regulation. Well, if I'm then an aluminum producer, I might go to this country, produce all the aluminum, pollute the air, which is cheap because there are no price on emissions. I can do whatever I do anyway. And so I can produce very cheaply this aluminum. I then sell this aluminum to European countries and undercut any producer in Europe because the European producer have to pay all this carbon pricing or have to buy their emission certificates to be able to even produce aluminum. So there's no competition anymore. The European producers are all gone and everybody's importing it from the low regulation country, and pollution just continues somewhere else. And it might be even worse somewhere else than it would be in Europe. That's a huge problem with these carbon trading systems. So there are two solutions to this. Solution one, which is not really feasible, is to say we have a global emissions trading system. Well, unfortunately, that's not feasible. You will not get all countries on the planet to agree on that system. And especially, even if they agree at one point in time, you can have countries exiting and entering and changing things around. Think of the Paris Agreement, where certain countries, I won't name specific countries, but decided to exit multiple times and then re-enter and so on and so forth. So it's not really possible to do that at an international level. The second option is to say, well, we have a border adjustment mechanism in place. The European Union calls it the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, and they fix that loophole. This has been ongoing in terms of measurement last year and is ongoing this year, and starting next year, it will charge money. So that can become a potential big item over the next couple of years, which will change to some extent the pricing models of a lot of products. It can include data centers. It can include the calculation if you have an app or where you want to locate the computation for this app, but to just say broadly how this works. So if you produce aluminum in the EU, you track your emissions, and based on the emissions, you pay you need to get licensed to emit that much, which means that you're part of the trading system and you pay a certain amount per ton of CO2. If you're abroad and you're exporting to the EU, what will happen is it will be looked at and you need to basically write down and prove how many emissions you produced in the process of producing this aluminum that you're now exporting to the EU. And once you have certified that amount, you need to either pay into the European system. And so it's basically kind of a tax or a tariff, whichever way you want to look at that, the EU will be charged on your aluminum produced, or you need to prove that you paid into another carbon trading system in terms with an equivalent amount. So assume you're a US aluminum mill, you're producing aluminum, and you're taxed at, let's say, 10 euros per ton of CO2. You want to export it to Europe, and in Europe, the price is 60 euros per ton. That would mean that you need to pay 50 euros per ton of aluminum exported to the EU to this European trading system. So there's no clear advantage of producing everything in the US relative to the EU. This will solve the loophole. So far, what they've done in the last 2 years, so 24 and 25, and is ongoing still, is they're basically going to each export it to the EU or import from, like any EU company importing from abroad, and collecting data. And specifically making sure that any import into the EU has a known amount of CO2 production or emissions. So we know of every item that enters the European Union, that how much CO2 was produced in the process of making that good. Starting 26, the adjustment will start, and the currently six key industries like steel, aluminum, concrete, and three others are going to have to pay this border adjustment. And over the next 4 years, it will have the same coverage as the ETS system, meaning it will cover basically every good you can imagine. What does that mean? Well, this means that any advantage you might have had because of lower regulation abroad relative to the EU will be gone when producing goods for the EU market. And that can be, again, a very important factor that can become relevant over the next couple of years if you're considering producing anything in the direction of carbon intensive or tech development, computation center or cloud data center that will potentially have large emissions. If the advantage of going in a low regulation country will be gone in the next 5 or so years. Okay, so this is the regulation side. So what does that mean? What does that mean for data centers? Well, to some extent, the good news is we have obvious factors which Hadi already talked about extensively, like latency, cooling need. We also have direct subsidies and some the electricity composition in terms of what is hydro, what is solar, etc. All these factors are obviously relevant. The electricity mix is not something that might cost you directly because there might be no carbon pricing where you set up the data center. But with these emissions trading systems coming online, they can become and start becoming relevant. So this externality of the emissions of you doing these queries in ChatGPT, etc., start becoming internalized because you need to pay for the carbon emissions of the data center on which all these things run. And so they will slowly be taken into account the more countries have this carbon pricing system. Okay, well, what additional things could become relevant over the next couple of years? And obviously, we have a bottom line right now, which we know is, okay, the more electricity I use, the more expensive it gets, and the more subsidies I get from governments for location of data centers, the cheaper it gets, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some clear cost-benefit calculations right now, but there are some factors that will come in more over the next couple of years. One of them is the border adjustment. So the border adjustment will lead to higher prices if you try to avoid regulation or emissions to become part of your calculation. That can become a big factor. But there's other factors which start becoming more relevant going forward. Right now, we are a lot based on nuclear power and oil, coal, and gas power plants that produce our electricity. We are shifting more and more towards renewable, solar, wind, and hydro. But as Hadi already mentioned, those are have their own shortcomings. Solar energy is strongest around noontime, which means it's the cheapest and the most available. Wind is often offshore because there's a lot of noise. If you've ever stood next to a wind power plant, you know that they can be noisy. So that's why you don't want them to have next to a neighborhood of people. You also don't want them next to a neighborhood of people because they might not look nice. But aside from that, you have certain limitations also. If there's no wind, well, the wind power plant doesn't produce any wind. And similarly with some of the other factors, like if you have a big storm, hydropower plants can run because they will be overwhelmed with the water, and the water is not particularly clean because there's a lot of rock in there, trees in there, and other stuff. So it's harder to run those in a sustained and reliable manner. While nuclear power is something that just runs and creates very convenient baseline energy. We also need to take into account the electricity losses. So if you look at a power grid of like the US, you have losses due to transmission, which are somewhere between 5 and 10%. So they can be quite substantial. So if you can be close to the source of power, that will reduce your cost there as well. As mentioned, the carbon footprint itself will to some extent be taken into account in your cost. So if you're purely based on solar panels, or even produce your own electricity based on solar panels on the facility, that might be very convenient and save you a lot of money in the terms of carbon pricing and having to pay for those electricity separately. But you will need to have energy storage. You will need to have huge batteries, and you need to be able to shift the power supply from one place to another, because those will be we know, as I said, at noontime, we have the highest electricity production, while between 4 and 10 p.m. In the afternoon/evening is our biggest electricity consumption. So that, or residential, definitely. And so because of that, we kind of have this gap between production at a specific time slot and consumption at a specific other time slot. And so that might be worthwhile, as already also mentioned by Hadi, if you have specific electricity intensive applications running, you want to time it that it is during the time where you actually have electricity, and that will become more and more important as we become more and more reliable on a renewable energy mix. So to sum up, what are factors that are becoming more important in the future? Well, more countries will go towards carbon pricing models. We will have more emphasis on renewable electricity generation, and more countries will start doing these border adjustments, which all will change to some extent the cost calculation going forward. So if I do today the calculation, where should a data center be? A lot of these factors might be, okay, I want to be good for the planet, so that's the decision I make, but it might cost me a little bit more if I actually go for the green solution. This might change in the next couple of years, that actually the cheapest solution will be the one that will be also the least, produce the least emissions. Okay, that's all I have for you guys. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you so much.